For more MTG resources and articles, check out paperchampion.net.
This is Tao with MTG Forge, and today I want to talk to you about a deck that I've really been wanting to play for a long time, and that is Mono Blue Faeries. Now, I really like the Faeries tribe. I think that their controlling nature really is like the style that I like to play. I actually kind of like the blue-black variant, and in fact that's my first tier 1 modern deck that I actually put together in paper. But I found is that the Faeries decks generally aren't really super competitive, but they are really fun to play. Now, the mono blue variant of Faeries is actually pretty fun, but it's also pretty budget because you don't have things like Bitter Blossoms, and you don't have too many Vendilion Cliques or any Vendilion Cliques or things like that. Drive the price up. So this deck is actually pretty good in that it's a low budget deck, but it's still super fun to play. Now, the one thing about Faeries is that it's actually extremely difficult to play this deck. It's not a beginner deck at all. There's a lot of little interesting things that happen, and you play most of your spells on your opponent's turn. Alright, so let's go through and look at how this deck works, and I'll show you just by introducing each of the creatures first. Then we'll take a look at support spells after that. Okay, so in the 1-drops, we got one Faerie Imposter. So Faerie Imposter is a 2/1 with flying for 1, but you have to return a creature you control to to your hand, otherwise you have to sacrifice it. Right, so that seems like kind of a bad thing, but with the way Faeries works is that's actually a benefit, in a way. Okay, we also need some 1-drops, so we have Faerie Miscreant. Now, the reason why this is in here is just because it's a 1/1 for 1, alright, with flying, so it's actually pretty good. So it's got a little bit of evasion. Sometimes it's going to draw you a card. So when Faerie Miscreant enters the battlefield, if you have another one, you get to draw a card. Right, so sometimes it'll draw you a card, but that's not really what it's for. It's just a 1/1 body that we need. Right, going on, we have Quickling. Now, Quickling is essentially the same as the Faerie Imposter. Okay, so except it has Flash. Okay, now Flash, if you don't know, it means that you can cast it anytime you can cast an instant. Right, so typically we cast this on our opponent's end step or something like that. Okay, so basically, it has Flash Flying, it's 2/2 for 2. When Quickling enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless you return another creature you control to its owner's hand. So basically, we have to bring another fairy back to our hand in order to play this card. Right? Spellstutter Sprite is another pretty much a staple in Faeries tribals. So another 1/1 for 2 with flash and flying, but when Spellstutter Sprite enters the battlefield, counter target spell with converted mana cost X or less, where X is the number of fairies you control. Right, so we're trying to get down fairies, and as our fairy army builds up, we're going to be using things like Spellstutter Sprite to basically control our opponent. So this is basically like a counter spell, and it gets more and more effective as you get more and more fairies onto the battlefield, so as the game goes on. Right, now we have Pestermite. So another 2/1 for 3 with flash and flying again. When Pestermite enters the battlefield, you may tap or untap a target permanent. Okay, so that's basically going to tap down one of our opponent's big threats, or sometimes we can cast it just to put a body onto the field and then untap one of our lands for a Vapor Snag or something like that. So there's a lot of uses for this. Okay, and then we have Sion of Oona, which is a Fairy Lord. Basically, it's a 3-mana 1/1 with flash, flying, and other fairies you control get +1/+1, and other fairies you control also get Shroud. Okay, meaning that it's basically like Hexproof, but you can't even target them with abilities, right? So it's kind of like a worse version of Hexproof, but still gives your fairies Shroud, which means they can't be targeted by lightning bolts or things like that, but they can still be targeted by things like Pyroclasm that don't have targets. So things that say all creatures get this, then that can still target them. All right. Finally, we have Mistbind Clique. So Mistbind Clique is our most expensive mana cost card. So it's a 4 mana for 4. With flash and flying, and you have to champion a fairy. So basically, when Mistbind Clique comes into the battlefield, you have to basically exile another fairy that's on the battlefield already. When a fairy is championed with Mistbind Clique, tap all lands target player controls. So you basically try and cast this on your opponent's upkeep right after their untap step, and then basically tap their land and time walk them for that turn. Now, you don't have to do that necessarily. You could actually wait and look at the style that your opponent's playing. Sometimes your opponent doesn't play anything like until after their attacks. Right, so one thing that will happen is that once your opponent realizes that you're playing Mistbind Clique, they might wait to play their land. So they will, you'll go through their untap phase. During their upkeep, you'll flash this in, tap all their lands, then they'll drop a land down, and then they have at least 1 mana to play that turn. So it might not be the best to play it exactly at that time, but usually that's what you're going to do. So basically, with all the fairies, they fall into 2 categories. There's basically the fairies that do something, like Mistbind Clique, okay, Pestermite, tapping, Spellstutter Sprite, which is counters, and Sion of Oona, which is giving your bonuses and Shroud. Right, and then you have things that are basically repeaters. So you have things like Quickling. Mistbind Clique is kind of like that in a way. One thing I didn't mention about Mistbind Clique is that once it leaves the battlefield, the fairy that it championed also re-enters the battlefield, right? And this is where things start to get really complicated. So we have things that are repeaters, and what I mean by repeaters is that they send these cards back to your hand so you can cast them again. So for instance, you can flash in a Spellstutter Sprite to counter a spell, and there you got this on the battlefield. Let's say your opponent targets it with, I don't know, a lightning bolt just to kill it, right? Then you can use a Quickling, right, to basically replace it. So you flash in the Quickling in response to a lightning bolt, then you have to return another creature to your hand so you can bring the Spellstutter Sprite back to your hand to cast again. And you can do that with the Faerie Imposter, or you can also do that with Mistbind Clique. It gets kind of complicated because what you can do is exile a Mistbind Clique, and then you could, let's say you have a Spellstutter Sprite, someone targets it, you cast Mistbind Clique to champion it, so that's gone. Okay, it exiles, Mistbind Clique comes, and then let's say they I don't know, try and target your Mistbind Clique with something like Path to Exile. Then you can use Quickling to replace it. But once Quickling brings it back to your hand, then Spellstutter Sprite comes back to your back to play as well. So, and then you can counter that spell. So it gets really kind of complicated with the interactions, and I mess it up all the time. This is a deck that's going to take a lot of practice, and like I said, it's definitely not for beginners, but it's a ton of fun to play because there's always like a lot of things going on. All right, so after that, we have basically just different forms of counters and disruption. So we have, let's see, Unsummon. So just 1 mana, return target creature to owner's hand. That's just kind of annoying. So your opponent has like a big threat out. Let's say they pump it up, has a whole bunch of counters or whatever. You just bring it back to their hand. And, let's say they put a whole bunch of enchantments on it or something, then basically they can't do anything with that. Vapor Snag. So basically the same thing, except its controller loses 1 life. Okay, Mana Leak is your typical 3 counters. So let's pull the one with flavor or the text on there. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Okay, so just your typical counter. And Remand. So Remand basically counter target spell. You get its counter, it goes back to the hand instead of the graveyard, but you get to draw a card off of it as well. So that's basically our counters package. Now, what we're going to do for lands is play 3 of Faerie Conclave. Okay, now Faerie Conclave basically can become a fairy, so in a pinch you could actually make it into a fairy and then champion that fairy to bring it back to your hand to drop a Quickling or something like that, or sometimes it can just sneak in for a final 2 damage that your opponent might not expect. Ghost Quarter just for some land disruption, a whole bunch of, and basically all the rest are just islands. So let's see, that's 15 islands. So that basically pretty budget mana base. Now in the sideboard, the sideboard's always optional depending on what your meta is and what you're expecting to see. But Spreading Seas is always a good choice. So Enchant Land, basically you get to draw a card off of it, and it makes one of your opponent's lands an island, which can really mess up their mana. 3 negates, so counter a target non-creature spell. Another Echoing Truth, just return target non-land permanent and all other permanents with the same name to their owner's hand, so that can deal with like tokens or maybe even an Ensnaring Bridge or something like that. Okay, Dispel, counter target instant spell, for 1. Okay, and then really we have other things like a couple Pithing Needles, Relic of Progenitus for graveyard strategies, and Dragon Claw against burn. So there's other things you could put in there. You could put like Spell Skites, for instance. If you really wanted to go expensive, you could throw in a Snapcaster Mage or something like that as well. There's tons of things you could add in there, but really it's just up to you. So anyways, that's the deck. It's, like I said, it's very interesting to play. There's a lot of interactions, and most of the play happens on your opponent's turn. So anyways, stay tuned, and if you'll check out the gameplay videos of it, hopefully I'll do a good job of it. I don't have a ton of experience playing this one, so I hope I totally don't botch it. Anyways, if you do like the videos, remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and Happy New Year!
It's that time again for random card review, so let's click on a random card and see what we get. Okay, so random card is Provoke from Stronghold, and actually it's in a bunch of other sets, Vintage Mastered, okay, and Conspiracy, oh cool. Alright, so Provoke is one of anything in a green, untap target creature you do not control, that target blocks this turn, if able, draw a card. Actually, I'd say this is actually a pretty good card. Being able to force one of your opponent's creatures to block is actually a pretty good ability, and also getting card draw is pretty sweet, and something that green doesn't get a ton of. Usually that's in the realm of blue. So I'd say this is a very strong card. Like, I would do it maybe just to get the card draw. Still, as with most cards, it's something you have to build around. Obviously you have to have strong creatures in your deck, but it reminds me actually kind of as the counters deck that I built from Free Deck Frenzy, where you can instantly untap one of your creatures and then force them to attack another creature. In this one, you're forcing them to block another creature. So it could be a nice surprise that you could have in the middle of a combat or before a combat. Anyways, I agree with the 3.5 rating. It's usually these ratings are pretty close. Sometimes I just don't agree with them at all, but this one I actually do agree with 3.5 out of 5. It's a pretty sweet card. Anyways, that's the random card review. Thanks for watching. See you next time.